Middle Way Philosophy, Introductory Video 5C. Sceptical Slippage, Why Doubts Become Denials, by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 5 on agnosticism. Sceptical slippage emerges because of an ambiguity in the term no. If somebody makes a claim, but you say no to that claim, that could mean one of two possible things. Either you definitely think that that claim is untrue, or alternatively, you simply fail to agree with it. In the ancient world, that difference is represented by the difference between two philosophers. Pyrrho, who was a skeptic in a balanced, agnostic sort of way, and Carneades, whom you could call a skeptic in the denialist sense. So, skeptical slippage is the assumption that somebody who takes a position like that of Pyrrho, who merely fails to affirm a claim that's made on the grounds that it's uncertain, it's the assumption that he's making the same sort of claim as somebody who says that because of that uncertainty, therefore that claim should be denied. That's the kind of view taken by Carneades, who was known as a so-called academic skeptic. Skeptical slippage involves the imposition of a false dilemma, so as to squeeze out any kind of agnosticism which recognises the uncertainty involving ultimate claims of any kind. It involves squeezing us between positive metaphysics and negative metaphysics. Positive and negative metaphysics, for example, making claims like God exists, or there is free will, or the mind is a separate substance from the body. Negative metaphysics making the opposite kinds of claims. God does not exist. There is no mind separate from the body. Determinism as the alternative to free will, denying free will. Taking God's existence as an example, skeptical slippage involves the lumping in of agnostics with atheists by theists. So, for example, if an agnostic, represented here by Pyrrho, says that I don't believe that God exists, which for him indicates agnosticism, somebody represented by the Pope here, or the ex-Pope, who represents the theistic perspective, will interpret that as meaning that he believes that God doesn't exist. So he's one of those atheists he's lumped together in the same camp as atheists who definitely deny the existence of God. Atheists, of course, can make exactly the same mistake by assuming that agnostic arguments provide a justification for the belief that God doesn't exist. Therefore, that agnostics, or at least those who use agnostic arguments, are atheists in the sense of people who believe that God doesn't exist. Ricky Gervais is supposed to have said that saying atheism is a belief system is like saying not going skiing is a hobby. But again, he fails to recognise here the distinction between believing that something is not the case and merely failing to affirm it because of uncertainty. Gervais's perspective here can also be represented by the philosopher Bertrand Russell's example of the orbiting teapot. Russell argued that there might, conceivably, be a small teapot somewhere orbiting in the darkness around the Earth, but that he was under no obligation to argue against the existence of such a teapot. In the same way, he argued, he was under no obligation to necessarily prove for certain in any way the non-existence of God. Although, in terms of the example itself, Russell's point is fair enough. What it doesn't take into account is the importance of the beliefs concerned. We're much less concerned about whether or not a teapot exists orbiting the Earth than we are about God. And our beliefs about God, or not about God, are of much more practical concern in the end, given the negative effects of metaphysical belief, than our beliefs about an orbiting teapot. So the point that both Russell and Gervais are quite reasonably making is that trivial agnosticism is practically indistinguishable from trivial denial, given that the orbiting teapot is both uncertain and inconsequential. In effect, I don't need to engage with it. It's probably better if I don't engage with it. But in a way, that's thorough agnosticism applied to the teapot. You might call it trivial denial. Compare that, however, to metaphysical agnosticism. It's a different matter, because metaphysical agnosticism does matter. It's different from metaphysical denial in important practical ways because of the negative effects of metaphysical denial along with metaphysical affirmation. Those points are gone into in much more depth in the video in this series, What's Wrong with Metaphysics, which explains particularly why metaphysical beliefs lead to repression and conflict, how they have a negative effect on our thinking in general. Russell's teapot is a quite different kind of case from beliefs about God, for example, or beliefs about truth, precisely because God or truth are so meaningful to people. People have very strong sets of meaningful associations with those particular concepts or ideas, which of course makes them much more powerful when people turn those imagined ideas into metaphysical beliefs. It's that kind of power which is used in a metaphysical way, which is narrowed and turned into a mere abstraction in metaphysical belief, that makes it so damaging. Having metaphysical beliefs about trivial matters is obviously going to have far less effect, practically speaking. Let's think more then about why skeptical slippage happens. One of the obvious causes is the cognitive bias known as false consensus. In false consensus, we tend to assume that people who are in our group are very much like us, and we wonder why other people who aren't like us. Or alternatively, if they're beyond the pale, if they're not recognised as being in our group, we tend to also overemphasise the homogeneity of the outgroup. That's important, of course, if you think about the group of theists, for example. They're much more likely to think of those who are not theists as the other, as those atheists, regardless of distinctions between them. Another reason for skeptical slippage is the unholy alliance effect. This occurs when two forces, two groups, which are at least nominally opposed, are united in their vested interest to maintain the system which excludes third alternatives. You can see the unholy alliance effect at various points in history and in all kinds of situations. You can see it in class terms, where two extremes, maybe of upper and working classes, unite against the middle. You can see it in political terms, where two more extreme political parties unite against the middle one. You can see it in religious terms, where two entrenched opposed sets of beliefs like Protestantism and Catholicism, or Islam and Judaism, unite against any third alternative that might rear its head. The institutionalization of adversarial type systems also contributes greatly to the entrenchment of the unholy alliance effect. You can see this particularly in first past the post electoral systems, such as that used in the UK. This map shows graphically the way in which both Conservative in blue and Labour parties dominate England and Wales in electoral terms. Any effective challenges to that electoral system can be headed off by the mutual interests of the parties, and indeed any attempts to reform that electoral system have met with resistance for that reason. An even more pronounced such system exists in the United States, which entrenches Democrats and Republicans as the two opposed forces and totally excludes minor parties to a very large extent. Amongst the negative effects of skeptical slippage is the tendency to reject both positive and negative views of other groups or other traditions or other ideologies. Every tradition is in some way or to some degree a mixture. Some of its beliefs and ideas will address conditions because the people there have been consulting their experience, at least to some degree, in formulating their response to that situation. But if you wholly reject a particular tradition or ideology, then you are failing to capitalise or recognise those positive ideas which may be helpful from it, as well, of course, as the negative ones. The false consensus effect results in a tendency to see other groups solely in terms of their metaphysics, their absolute beliefs. The diversity within that group is not recognised, and the ideas indeed that might be helpful in that group are not recognised. We tend to see them as all the same colour when they're multicoloured. Sceptical slippage can also have a negative effect at individual level. We may cease to listen to others because we're misinterpreting their no's, as it were, their negative views perhaps, as denials of our beliefs, particularly as absolute or complete denials of our beliefs, rather than perhaps uncertainty or perhaps as partial criticism of some aspects of ourselves or of our practices or beliefs. Not listening can be a simple result of that, blocking off others and what we have to learn from them. So, to summarise, sceptical slippage occurs when arguments against positive metaphysics are interpreted as making negative metaphysical claims. That doesn't matter very much when beliefs are trivial, like Russell's teapot example, but it does matter with metaphysical beliefs. The meaning of positive metaphysical beliefs is probably rejected along with belief in them when this negative stance is taken or when it's assumed that it's being taken. Sceptical slippage is maintained by false consensus, by unholy alliances, and by institutionalized dualism, as exemplified, for example, in electoral systems. It tends to make people see the other side, so-called, solely in terms of their metaphysics, and to reject their positive ideas.